Just one thing before I start what I was going to talk about. I believe this week the BBC Academy has started running some training courses on loudness measurement and control. I don't know whether they're open to non-BBC staff, but no harm in asking. So that's something that's definitely happening. I have one other question. Are there any Australians in the audience? Excellent. Okay. Don't worry. Don't worry. Yeah. Okay. So, subject to my talk is whether we have, too many loudness recommendations and standards. We've had quite a few numbers already today, but I'm going to talk about 3 and a little bit about a 4th one. The principal ones being R128, which is the EBU recommendation, ATSC A85, which is the American standard, and BS 1864, so another ITU recommendation. There'll be a quiz at the end for all these numbers. But the question is, well, do we have more than one? Well, yes, there's more than one loudness recommendation. Is that going to cause us problems in trying to meet all the different requirements? Probably not, because they all have a single parent. Single parent family, not necessarily the best thing, but you can't, that's not a general criticism. All these things have a single parent. This is a picture of that parent. So we've spoken about this already. Florian's explained it. ITU RBS 1770. Who remembers what the BS stands for? Dear, oh dear. You do what you can. Yes. Anyway, so we have this K-weighting filter, some mean square and a weighted combination of those channels. Channels being presented from the rear have a slightly higher weighting than those presented from the front. Things coming from behind you sound a little bit louder subjectively. We did speculate that this was because of a sort of tiger defense mechanism, but somebody pointed out we had no proof whatsoever at all for that, so I don't mention that anymore. The thing that's missing from this slide is the gating function. The gating function is applied at the end of that, if you like. But this is just for simplicity. This meter gives you a reading in LUFS, L-U-F-S, and it is true I did calculate how much time the planet would save by calling it LUFS rather than LKFS, but people thought I was being frivolous and flippant even. How could I possibly be? So the answer comes out of this in LUFS. ITU calls it LKFS. People in the States tend to call it LKFS. They're wrong, but you try telling them. I've tried LUFS. LUFS is a measurement of an absolute loudness. So it's loudness units relative to full scale. So it's absolute measurement. If you want to talk about the difference between two loudnesses, then it's LU. So LUFS for an absolute measurement, LU for a relative measurement. Okay, so we know what we're talking about here. Florian already mentioned things about true peak, similar sort of diagram. But the true peak measurement is an interpolated measurement, so it's an approximation still. It's not a perfect measure of the true peak. So this we get an approximation for where that is because of the oversampling that is done in the meter. But at least we're measuring something closer approximation to true peak than just the maximum sample value. The units that come out of this meter are dBTP, as you've seen already, so decibels relative to, it's not really relative. Yeah, that unit's not very good. But decibels, true peak measurement. Skip over that bit of nomenclature, we'll fix it later. The other thing that was mentioned, loudness range. So Florian explained it's a kind of statistical measure. So this shows the distribution of loudnesses within the film The Matrix. So you can see that there are, there's some loud bits, lots of quiet bits. Who knows, maybe this is the dialogue, maybe this is some effects, general distribution of things. The way we measure the loudness range, we throw away everything that's below -70 LUFS, not worried about the digital zeros, and then we gate out everything that's 20 LU below the average once we've thrown away the -70 things. Oh, if it's too complicated, just go and read some of the EBU publications that I'll show later, and it'll explain it in more detail. But what we do is get a, oops, there, too many buttons. Well, 3, that's too many. Is that going backwards? Yes, there we go. So we end up with the loudness range for this example. We're not taking the very quietest bit, we're not taking the very loudest bit. We have this 25 LU loudness range. So those are the, basically the three things we're talking about. If you want to look more on terminology, here's one I prepared earlier. If you search for this, just Google BBC R&D White Paper 202. That will explain all these terms: LUFS, LKFS, LU, DBTP, DBFS. Has anybody here ever been confused about these terms? Yeah, well, Simon, you should know better. But have a read of this paper, and then, because it can matter, it can make a huge difference. If you use the wrong unit, things will go wrong. But so that's basically the background of the things that we're going to measure, the units that we use to talk about them, and now I'll move on to the recommendations that use them, having established that we all know what we're talking about: LUFS, DBTP, a little bit of loudness range. So the first one, here are the three. R128 will be the first one I'll talk about. HSC A85, ITRBS 1864. I'll drop in a little bit about the Australian Operating Practice 59, because we do have an Australian in the room. Please make him feel welcome. R128, this has the smiliest logo of any of the loudness recommendations. So a smiley face. It's also relatively brief, which I do like in a recommendation. Just to demonstrate, don't try to read the words, but you can see that the essence of R128 is contained in less than 1 page. It's really quite brief, nice and simple. What does it say? It says your target loudness should be minus 23 LUFS, measured using a gate. You're allowed a little bit of error around that, plus or minus 1 LU. You're allowed to miss the target by 1 LU. If you're working in a sort of post-production file-based environment, you have no excuse. You just push the button, it can normalize it to minus 23 LUFS, just like that. If you're working in a live environment, performance is going on and you're riding the fader, well, you might miss a little bit. Florian has demonstrated that it's actually not too difficult to hit the target, but it may be that Florian is just extremely skilled. Or maybe just does the same demonstration every time, and
for the second case.
Maybe it's a sort of automation thing. So we have a little bit of a window there, this plus or minus 1 LU. But if people spot that you're always hitting minus 22, they might come and have a word with you and say, you're not meant to work at the limit of the range, it's just a tolerance for live, principally. The other thing it says is that you should not go higher than minus 1 dBTP. So your true peaks should still have a tiny, tiny bit of headroom. This is in production. Yeah, I did put the words there. It's in production. The reason for that little bit of headroom is largely because the meter is not completely accurate. It does an oversampling to work out where the true peak is, but it doesn't oversample infinitely. It only does a 4 times oversampling, so there's still a little potential for an underread. So in order to guarantee that your true peak doesn't go above 0 dBFS in production, you need just a tiny, tiny bit of headroom over your true peaks. There's a couple of supporting documents here. Again, these are freely available from the EBU website, so tech.3343, that's guidelines for production. So how to make your program according to R128. And the other one, 3344, I'm sure Richard van Everdingen will talk a little bit more about that. I hope you will, because I don't have time for that. It's quite a big document. But that explains the distribution guidelines, so once you've made your program according to R128, how do you get it to the home without spoiling all your hard work? So moving on, HSC A85. Any Americans in the audience? Don't be embarrassed. Yeah, oh yeah, a couple. Right, that's okay. So HSC A85, sadly not a very smiley front cover, and it's also rather larger. This is a table of contents. There's 4 pages in the table of contents. It's a rather thicker document than R128. On the whole, it's kind of similar. The extra information in there, the other 80 or so pages, is because it goes into a lot of detail about metadata for controlling loudness and a lot about this anchor element. So Florian has already mentioned a little bit about the philosophies of measuring the whole program or just measuring the speech. Well, in A85, it talks more generally of an anchor element, which would often be the speech, but need not necessarily be. In a music program, it would be the music, and the speech might be incidental. So there's a lot of information in there about metadata and using the anchor element. So I'm just going to try and take off my watch here so I can see what time it is, because I'm aware that you have coffee next. I don't want to cause any stress for you. As I say, it's broadly similar. So the target level in ATSC A85 is minus 24 LUFS. If you recall, who was paying attention, target loudness in R128, minus 23. That's 2 people awake. I don't know. So minus 24 LUFS. Of course, they call it LKFS in ATSC. As I said, tried telling them, I'm going to call it LUFS because that is correct. In the way units are named, nomenclature, LUFS is what it should be. The K doesn't belong in the unit, so it's minus 24 LUFS, but when you read A85, it'll say LKFS. They're equivalent. Click. There we are. Slightly wider tolerance in ATSC A85, plus or minus 2 LU. The main reason for that is because of this use of the anchor element. You're allowed to decide what your anchor element is and pick a representative sample of dialogue from a feature film, for example. If Florian makes his measurement, picking a little bit of speech from somewhere at the beginning of the film, I make my measurement picking a different bit of representative dialogue from somewhere else in the film, we could get different answers. Of course, we're measuring different audio. So as a consequence of that, the tolerance allowed by A85 is twice that of the EBU R128. So you've got a window of plus or minus 2 LU around that target of minus 24 LUFS. It also talks of true peak. Your true peaks should not exceed minus 2 dB TP. That allows you some headroom for the distortions introduced by low bitrate coding, as Florian has already explained. Once you start mangling your signal, reducing the bitrate for transmission, you introduce distortions, so you need a little bit of headroom there. So having this limit of no more than minus 2 dB TP, you have a little bit of headroom for coding. Remember, in R128, the figure was minus 1 dB TP. That applied during production. Richard can explain more about what you do when you start to compress this for transmission, and the requirements will change. I said already, you can, ATSC A85 recommends, well, the most strong recommendation is to measure the anchor element. However, that can be difficult. The anchor element would typically be the speech in a movie, or at least that's what it's A85 is indicating. It can be difficult to isolate the speech in the movie, in which case you measure the full mix. And in fact, for short form content, commercials, short spots, things like that, A85 actually says to measure the full mix, not to isolate an anchor element. So it's a little bit, is it ambivalent? Yeah, you can measure the anchor element, or if that's too hard, just measure the full mix. I've explained already this, well, Florian's explained already, there is this dilemma whether to measure the speech or the full mix. There is work going on to try and resolve this again in the ITU. There's been some discussion about how to address it, whether to have different loudness levels for these things or a loudness level for the full mix, and then guidelines for how to produce the program so your dialogue is at the right level. If we had all that sorted, then we might be able, or the A85 might be able to bring down this 2LU tolerance a little bit, but that's work in progress, so watch this space. Moving on to the ITU, we have 1864. Now this is a recommendation that covers the international exchange of television programs, so it quite specifically does not apply to things taking place within a nation, does not apply to radio, it applies to the international exchange of television programs. So if we're trying to send things from Europe to the US or the US back to Europe, this is the one that that comes into effect. Again, it's refreshingly brief. The essence of it is possibly even shorter than that of R128. It all fits in much less than 1 page. What does it say? Well, it talks of minus 24 LUFS as being the target level. It doesn't say that it should be gated. It's not specific about that. That is perhaps something for a future revision, but minus 24 LUFS, so same number as A85, tiny bit different from minus 23 for R128. There's a tolerance around that again. You can miss the target a little bit, plus or minus 2 LU. Again, the reason for having the minus 2 rather than a rather tighter tolerance is because in 1864 it says you can measure the dialogue component or the full mix. And of course, if you're measuring the dialogue component and you choose a different bit of dialogue from somebody else, then you get a different result. So you need that wider tolerance because of the variation in actually what's being measured. 1864 does say you can measure all dialogue at the choice of the program provider. My opinion is that that's not necessarily fair, and actually perhaps it should be agreed between the provider and the recipient. So I've suggested in the ITU that we revise that wording. Otherwise it's a little bit one-sided. So you can choose to measure all or dialogue. Just have a quick overview of the time. Not too bad. And as we have, metadata. Who loves metadata? Get out. No, metadata. It's crucial. Not everybody's favourite, must be said. 1864 says you can use metadata to indicate the loudness. There's a bit of ambiguity that I hadn't realised was in there. R128 is very clear on this. If you're using metadata to indicate the loudness, the metadata should, of course, indicate the actual loudness. But whether or not you're using metadata, the loudness of the program should be normalized to the target level. So in R128, everything gets normalized to minus 23 LUFS, and therefore the metadata, dial norm in Dolby AC3, program reference level in MPEG-4, that would also be minus 23. The metadata matches the loudness, but the loudness will be target loudness, minus 23 LUFS. That was my interpretation of 1864, but it became apparent at the meeting in October that actually the US administration had quite a different reading of this, and that actually the target loudness level only applied when you are not using metadata to indicate the loudness. So if you're not using metadata, you can do anything you like. Now, that to me seems like a recipe for complexity, disaster, things going wrong. Certainly if you lose your metadata, you don't know where you are. So that is currently under discussion in the ITU, whether the target loudness applies when you are target loudness applies when you are using metadata. For a simple life, I think it should. Opinions vary. To be discussed. Now, as we have an Australian in the room, I'll say a little bit about the Free TV Australia Operating Practice 59. I didn't do a slide on this one because I didn't know we'd have any Australians here. But we do have OP59. It's very similar to the other ones. Well, they're all very similar, as I think you've seen. The target loudness in OP59 is minus 24 LUFS. Again, it says you could measure the speech or measure everything. There is a slightly misleading thing in there which has been a source of confusion. It suggests you might be able to measure the speech loudness by measuring the front center channel of a surround mix. That's only valid if you've mixed your audio that way. Often in movies, that is the style that's used, but it's not general. Constraining your dialogue only to be in the front center channel, having nothing but dialogue in there, and having no dialogue in any of the other channels. Yes, you could do that, but I think creatively that's a bit constraining. You wouldn't do that for radio, certainly. Well, I wouldn't. So it does suggest that, which I think is misleading. One of the other differences is that the target loudness of minus 24 LUFS, it's suggested that that only applies in normalizing for broadcast, not in production. So it says that the target loudness doesn't apply to you in production. It's something that you make your program, then you measure, then you normalize. That seems to me to be a slightly complicated way of doing things. Why not just make it to the target? But that's what EBU 59 says. They do have a number for the true peak for the headroom. Again, it's -2 dBTP, so you shouldn't exceed -2 dBTP. So that gives you a little bit of headroom for some processing. I'm going to talk a little bit now about some regulations that apply, because we love that. Why doesn't my button work? There we go. Oh, that surprised me slightly. Okay, I'll go through this one, then I'll do the regulation. Comparison of the main three things I've talked about. Our concern being that we have too many standards and that they're all different. Well, we have a number, but they're quite similar. So we have R128, -23 LUFS, gated measurement, measure the full mix, plus or minus 1 LU target, tolerance around that target, and -1 dB true peak headroom. ATSC 85, slightly different number, -24 LUFS, with this measurement of the anchor element or the full mix, slightly wider tolerance around that because of this choice of what to measure, plus or minus 2 LU, and tiny bit more headroom required, -2 dBTP, because they're thinking about allowing a bit of headroom for coding. ITU RBS 1864, -24 LUFS, again, it talks of measuring the dialogue or the full mix, and again, that window plus or minus 2 LU. Florian has already talked a little bit about the difference between the results you might get from measuring the speech or measuring the speech or the anchor. The difference between a gated measurement and an ungated measurement. Well, typically, normal program material applying the gate might raise the loudness level by something of the order of 1 LU. It's not going to be exact, it depends on the nature of the program. So the -23 gated and the -24 ungated, pretty much the same in practice. You may find that no adjustment to the program is required to meet both those at the same time. So the worry that you might have that we have all these different rules to follow, actually they're all very similar. Now, did I have a slide on regulation? Yes, I did. Yes, just got my order wrong. So 3 areas, UK, the US, and everywhere else. Sorry about that. In the UK, we have the Broadcast Committee of Advertising Practice. They have the BCAP code. It talks a little bit about loudness in there. For radio, I should say that this only applies to commercials or to the advertisements on commercial channels. For radio, it doesn't say very much. It says that the commercials should not be so loud as to cause a hazard for people driving, which is a good thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I was surprised when I read that how non-technical that was from an engineering background. For TV, it's rather more specific. For television, it says that the loudness of the advertisements should be in line with the maximum loudness of the programs into which they are inserted. So the loudness should stay, the average loudness should stay fairly constant. Program, commercial program, similar loudness. Ideally measure with a loudness meter conforming to ITU RBS 1770. If you're not going to use a loudness meter and you're going to use some kind of quasi-peak meter like a ppm, then it says your commercials, the adverts, should be 6 dB lower in level than the programs. So that's quite a nice encouragement to use a loudness meter. Otherwise, you just have to bring it down by 6 dB. In the USA, there's the CALM Act, the Commercial Advertisement Loudness Mitigation Act, which comes into force next Thursday, I think it is. Is it the 13th? I think next Thursday. Who's going to jail on Thursday? Good. Actually, nobody. Excellent. So the CALM Act says use ATSC A85, broadly speaking. The CALM Act itself, the gubbins of it, is very small. It references A85, which, as I've hinted earlier, is quite large. A lot of information in there. So that's going to be the law in the States. In Europe, well, Florian has already explained something of the situation in the various countries. Some have statutory regulation, others voluntary compliance because they see it as just a good thing. Generally speaking, the basis of the regulation or the voluntary practice is R128, so that's the European trend. So in conclusion, we do have a variety of recommendations. We love them, that's why we have so many. But they're generally speaking very similar. We have -23 LUFS, -24 LUFS, what's 1 LU between friends. We have a tight tolerance ±1 LU in R128, ±2 because of a slightly variable measurement method in HSC A85 and BS 1864. We have limits on the true peak, -1 dBTP, -2 dBTP, again, pretty similar. We do have this choice to make about measuring the full mix, which is nice and easy. And I would say ignoring some components of your program when you're measuring the loudness is a bit risky. If you're saying, yeah, the sound effects, the music, that never annoys anybody, we don't need to measure that. I would question the wisdom of that, but we do have to accept that the loudness of the speech is important because speech is important in many programs. So there is still that slight difference to work on. But actually, most things pretty similar. I think, yeah, that's the end. Now we have a few minutes for questions. I'm happy to take questions. Florian is happy to answer them.
So both meet outside and you can
take whatever you want. So, any questions here? Yeah, Kevin. There's a microphone coming right in a second. Maybe you state briefly what you're.
Yes, Kevin Hilton, freelance journalist here for Television Technology magazine. So Andrew and by extension Florian, we were talking about the similarity. You were talking about the similarity of the various standards and having the same roots. But I was talking to the chief executive of a loudness monitoring company during IBC, and his view was that there should be perhaps more merging of the two, and they take the best of R128 and the best of A85. He sees 128 as perhaps a little too technical, and 85 as a bit more practical. What would either of you think about the idea of perhaps merging the two, despite the similarities that already exist?
If we can persuade the US that we're right, which obviously we are, then that would be quite simple. I think
I would have said exactly the same. Thank you very much.
The structure of the documents is a little bit different. R128 is very simple and concise, and there's a lot of supporting information in the EBU Tech Docs 3343 and 3344. A85 has a lot of that kind of information inside A85 itself, rather than splitting it out. So there's quite a lot of explanatory information in there. In addition, they've made it slightly complicated for themselves because of this emphasis on the use of metadata, because it's mandatory to use Dolby AC3 in there, which has the metadata in it, so a lot of information there, because that can be a source of problems. If your metadata is wrong, your program's going to go wrong. So you have to get that right. And then there's more because of this anchor versus all measurement, so that has to be explained in there as well. The difference of the -23 and the -24, well, -23 is obviously the correct value because it is actually correct, because it uses gating. The -24 figure was picked before gating was included in the metering method, but the US has been adamant in refusing to change it, despite the fact that the meter has changed. So -23 LUFS with a gate is pretty much the same as -24 without a gate. A85 doesn't mention using a gate, but if it does, then you would expect the -24 to change to -23. I'm not holding my breath on that, but technically, looking at the numbers, it ought to. So in case of in merging these things, taking the best from all of them, we just end up with R128. So I have to say that, I'm sorry, because it's true. Fine. Florian, did you want to
Well,
add
of course,
anything?
we don't want to offend anybody. The thing is also.
I think I've done that for you.
No, it's really, it's good. We have been discussing about it, and I mentioned it briefly, the 23-24 target level issue at the last PLOUD meeting, because I was kind of ready to, I wouldn't say sacrifice, but to kind of approach the discussion that, okay, we might actually change to that. If gating is used everywhere and Europe is the only continent, so to speak, that stays at 23 and all the rest of the world is at 24, we might actually change to 24. But then the discussion circled around, well, but there's this higher tolerance, and our tolerance of ±1 around 23 already fits now in 24 ±2. So basically, it's inside already, that one. And it was decided by the whole group, PLOUD, that we stick to 23. So that's going to be it. So there's not going to be harmonization here, I'm afraid. As far as true peak levels is concerned, I think that's a no issue, because true peaks are just a technical parameter and have no implication whatsoever on production. Whatsoever. There's absolutely... Actually, I think here we are also on the good side in Europe, because we have different true peak levels depending on different platforms. So -1 for linear PCM production, then we have -3 for data reduced audio. That's what Andrew has not mentioned yet. We have actually also a recommended true peak level for data reduction systems, which is -3. And then we also have transported the whole idea of adjusting the true peak level, keeping the loudness level across platforms for instance, FM radio, where the true peak level, when you have -23 loudness as your nominal deviation, is -6.7 or -6.2 in some circumstances, dB true peak. So we have varying true peak levels, dependent on the platform, which is, I think, well thought out. And everywhere else in the world, there's just one true peak level for everything. So I think also here, I think it might, be reasonable that the others look at, what we have done in Europe. And we have structured it in a different way, just as Andrew has said. Our basic recommendation is really brief, and then we have a lot of supporting documents. And A85 has everything in one document, the recommendation and all the explanations. So we deliberately, made it very short and concise so that everybody can read it in, 2 minutes actually. And then for additional information about the practical work, we have practical guidelines or production guidelines. So I think, yeah, there's some substance behind what we did in essence. And also, I have to say that, the group PLOUD consists of people all around the world, also Americans, Japanese, Australians, South Africans, Europeans, Brazilians. So we are truly a fully international group. So a lot of input also from all over the globe has run into our work. So we'll see. I mean, does it really give us a lot of trouble, whether it's 23, 24, these tolerances? I don't think so. As long as we have the major difference for dynamic programs of speech versus all measurement, that's the biggest gap that we still have to find a solution for. And it still necessitates that for program exchange, you have to talk to the other side, to the receiving end. There is no way around that. It has been in the past like that. It will be in the future like that. That's for sure. We'll see. We are open, of course. We are not putting a wall around these things, but it has to be some, good mutual discussions with that.
I'm aware that it's coffee time, but I'm happy to take more questions. Gentlemen there.
We have been, I'll be talking about this later, it's MC Patel from Emotion Systems. We've been talking to a number of clients about implementing this, and obviously we make correction tools. They're getting a lot of files rejected because of momentary and short-term loudness. So you can get -23, but you don't meet momentary loudness, and there are even people asking for that and PPM. How are we going to try and get people to understand that there is -23 is kind of the target to choose or go for?
I can answer that because we have been talking about these issues also at the last PLOUD meeting. There seems to be a lack of depth of explanation that we had regarding the maximum of momentary and short-term loudness. We have briefly mentioned two numbers in the practical guidelines in TechDoc 3343, and broadcasters happily took those and put them into regulations, which was definitely not intended. It was just as a first starting point. The reason why we actually put in some limits for short-term loudness and momentary loudness was that in commercials, the basic idea could be abused. If you have the average -23, then you could actually, mix a commercial in a way with very low-level atmosphere just above the gate for 20 seconds and then one really loud shout in the last second. That would actually really be annoying. And we originally thought that we might, be able to control it with loudness range, but loudness range is a measure that starts at 30 seconds or 1 minute. It's not, it doesn't give any meaningful number below 30 seconds or so. So we had to find other kind of safety nets. And the parameters we chose then were to limit the momentary or the short-term loudness, or momentary or short-term loudness. And a couple of people have misunderstood and have put limits on momentary and short-term loudness and have taken our initial numbers, which you might look at as strict regulations. And so for the next issue or next version of the production guidelines, which will be released in next year, we will make that very clear that the maximum momentary and maximum short-term are for very specific reasons in very specific areas, and that you have to be very careful, not to be too strict on these things, because we still need experience here. Yeah? And I would be very reluctant to put, maxima too strict maxima than on the whole program and these kind of things, because one of our main goals is to allow more dynamics. There are areas where it really makes sense, but we have to be very specific, what to do with those measures and how to use it, and not to put the audio into too tight a cage. But was certainly also our fault to some extent that we didn't explain it, in depth enough. All right. So we are 5 minutes into the coffee break already. So hurry outside. There is something waiting for you.